Hello, and welcome to Word of Mouth. As our continued efforts to highlight the American history section of our library for this month, today I will be reading from the Stonewall Reader, published in 2019. Now, as a reminder, Word of Mouth is an adult story time, and this will be dealing with topics of human sexuality, so viewer discretion is advised as always. Furthermore, I will be attempting to edit on the fly, as it were, to avoid any problematic language that was being reclaimed that I could not myself claim. And for the good of everyone listening, of course. I will be reading the foreword, the introduction, and two stories from within this anthology. Foreword. There's something wonky and inappropriate about nearly every major protest event in history. The British inspired the Boston Tea Party because they wanted tax revenue to pay for battles they had fought on behalf of their American colonies. When the French revolutionaries destroyed the Bastille, there was only 7 prisoners within, most of which were aristocrats who came with their pets, their own furniture, and hundreds of books. The Stonewall Uprising protested a police raid on a mafia-owned gay bar and dance spot with no running water, where glasses were washed in filthy suds and reused, and which was protected by a straight extortionist mafia goons. But each of these uprisings came along with the right historical moment. Americans were fed up with taxation without representation. The French were protesting rising national debt, extremes in wealth and poverty, expensive foreign wars, and an autocratic government. And gays, who had never really resisted arrest, stood up for themselves at last. There were many causes of this historical resistance. Throughout the 1960s, the city had shut down gay bars out of deference to tourists visiting for the World's Fair, which was mainly designed to showcase America's business power, and behind it was the wealth of Tammany Hall mayor Robert Wagner. But at the time of Stonewall, in that pre-internet age, that was the main place for those who identified as queer to be. It seemed gay and lesbian bars were being left in peace. Everyone assumed Mayor John Lindsay was a nice guy because he looked like Kennedy. The clientele of the Stonewall had gradually changed from white to black and Hispanic, kids who were used to being in the fight with cops. And it was a very hot day outside. And Judy Garland, the passionara of gay men, had died on June 22nd, 1969, from a Seconal overdose at the age of 47, and lay in state in Manhattan's Frank E. Capel Funeral Home. The Stonewall riots began on June 28th at 3 in the morning. They went on for 3 days, and at times the whole of Chadron Square was cordoned off. Most importantly, the sexual revolution, Black Power, anti-Vietnam War demonstrations had all shown the efficacy of protest. The United States had gradually shifted from espousing a morality of duty to a newfound yen for self-fulfillment. Gone were the days of sacrificing one's own pleasure for the sake of convenient values. Typical of the 60s were alternative publications, such as Screw and Hustler, who urged their readers to indulge their desires. The Kinsey Report had already reassured people, straight and gay, how many adults had at least experimented with non-procreative sex. Black Power had replaced the class analysis of the left with race analysis of the civil rights movement. War protesters in the days of the universal obligatory male draft had inspired the majority to oppose a war we apparently couldn't win, that didn't serve our nation's interests, and had become a killing field of thousands of soldiers. And we were seeing how effective those protests could be. The burgeoning women's movement was showing that sisterhood is powerful, a preview of upcoming attractions in our American dialogue. Women prisoners locked up in Jefferson Market Prison, since raised, were shouting down encouragements to Stonewall protesters resisting police. Many, if not most historians, would argue that major events such as gay liberation are not sudden but gradual, incremental, and as someone who lived through Stonewall, I would claim that the uprisings were decisive. Although there were small gay rights groups such as the Machinte Society, the first met under the name of the Society of Fools, Macchino, in the Italian word for a masked harlequin, most gay people, including the author, had hardly heard of them. Before Stonewall, the prevailing theories of homosexuality, even amongst those who identified as queer, were that they were sinners, criminals, or mentally ill. There was a certain moment at a gay cocktail party in the 1950s, for instance, when the group the author was with would all put down their martinis and say, "Gosh, we're sick." I spent some 20 years on such a couch trying to go straight, and was assured by various drinks that homosexuality was just a symptom of a deeper disorder. Oppressive mother, absent father was a favorite, or being arrested in the prior stages. Almost no one could see queerness as something along the normal spectrum of human or animal behavior. The Mormons were making deviant boys look at homoerotica and then submitting them to shock therapy. Priests were listening to tearful confessions before counseling their little sinners. Many Protestant sects were sending their minors to boot camp for conversion therapy. 3 states still ban all forms of sodomy, including oral and anal sex, even among heterosexuals. A 2003 Supreme Court decision decriminalized homosexuality even among consenting adults in 14 states. The Stonewall Uprising changed attitudes, first among lesbian and gay people. In 1970, I moved to Rome for 6 months, and I came back carnivorous gay dance clubs, complete with go-go boys and white towels under blacklight, had suddenly sprung up. The Gay Academic Union started in 1973 and lasted 4 years. Gay political groups formed. Pride marches were held in scores of cities in anniversary of Stonewall. As I write, we're approaching the 15th anniversary. This book, by the way, was written quite a long time ago, for those curious. Same-sex civil unions and then marriages were legalized. Openly lesbian and gay volunteers were accepted into the armed forces. In many places, discrimination against lesbians and gays in the workplace and in housing became illegal. These rights are precious and were hard won by generations of activists, but the change in attitudes is parallel and nearly as important. I was engaged twice, hurt my fiancés, doubted all my impulses, feared a bitter and lonely old age, predicted on every side. Even today, well-meaning heterosexuals lament that I'm confusing a gay author. Would they be equally shocked by a Jewish or African-American writer? Oh no, sorry. Philip Roth and Toni Morrison are universal authors. When I was a kid, I knew very few gay couples, and no one would have sided with who would be willing to adopt me as one of their own. When I worked for Time Life from 1962 to 1970, I had to refer my boyfriends as women, otherwise I would have been fired. My dad fired an employee because he was unmarried at 30 and wore cologne. I suppose the horror stories bore everyone. I just want to finish with one observation. Because of Stockholm's uprising, people saw homosexuals no longer as criminals or sinners or mentally ill, but as something like members of a minority group. It was an oceanic change in thinking. Edmund Wright. Introduction. 25 years ago, this book was published in 2019 again, for those keeping count. The New York Public Library presented an exposition, Becoming Visible, The Legacy of Stonewall, curated by Mimi Bowling, Molly McGarry, and Fred Wasserman, as well as an accompanying catalog. Planned to commemorate Stonewall 25, it was the first exhibit devoted to LGBTQ+ history by a major New York cultural institution. It had the highest attendance of any NYPL expedition except the Dead Sea Scrolls. In my years working on LGBTQ collections at the library, I had countless people tell me that the exhibition changed their lives because it was the first time they had felt their history was publicly embraced and treated with seriousness it deserved. The exhibition was an opportunity to show the riches of the library's LGBTQ archives, which had recently been acquired by far-sighted curators in partnership with grassroots activists. Now, with the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, the library is able to open those archives through this analogy to give contemporary readers insight into pivotal this era LGBTQ history through first-hand accounts of actual participants. That's why we're reading it today. The Stonewall Inn, located at 53 Christopher Street in New York, began as a tea house, Bonnie Stonewall, in 1930, and evolved into a restaurant. After a fire destroyed the interior in the 1960s, Stonewall was reopened by Fat Tony Loria as a gay bar. Part of a network of mafia-controlled illegal gay clubs and after-hours joints in the village, like the Bonsoir, the 10th of Always, and Cookies, Stonewall was operated as a private club rather than a publicly opened bar, to evade the control of state liquor authorities. Every weekend, patrons paid $3 and signed the club's register, often as Judy Garland or Donald Duck, to get into Stonewall, drink watered-down liquor, and dance to the music of the Rosettes, the Shangri-Las as well. Despite the burnt interior, dirty glasses, surly staff, the Stonewall, one of the few gay clubs in the village where patrons could dance, drew a devoted young clientele, many cross-dressed, wearing makeup or their own personal mix of men's and women's attire. The police routinely raided the Stonewall, but the management, always mysteriously tipped off in advance, would turn up the lights to warn the crowd to stop any open displays of affection, slow dancing, or use of illicit drugs. According to most historians, the Stonewall's management bribed the police for protection, and the raids were merely for show. But on Tuesday, June 24, 1969, there was another kind of raid, organized by the NYPD's 1st Division, rather than the usual local 6th precinct. When the club was backed up and running a few days later, the police decided to go in again on Saturday, June 28th, and shut it down for good. Police were accustomed to handling a large gay crowd with only a handful of officers, but this night the raid went very differently. Rather than leave, a crowd of patrons and onlookers gathered in front of the bar and waited for their friends held inside to be released. When the police van came to take away those who had been arrested, the crowd fought back, forcing the police into the bar. The riot gathered force from onlookers, who turned on the barricade bar with garbage cans and fire. The drag queens were said to have given the police both the fiercest resistance and a dose of humor, facing them down a chorus line as they sang, "We are the Stonewall Girls." The crowd was controlled and dispersed in the early hours of Saturday morning, only to re-emerge later that night as several thousand people took to the streets chanting "Gay Power" and "Liberate Christopher Street." Riots and demonstrations continued throughout the following week. In the end, the arrests and damages were minimal. What shocked both the gay and straight establishment was that those who would identify as queer had openly decided to fight back. This is the story in a nutshell. Everything else has become the stuff of legend and debate. First, we cannot agree on who to call and what to call this series of events. Was it a riot or an uprising? Activists and reporters at the time called it a riot, eager to compare it to the many other historical riots of the 1960s, such as those against racial oppression in Watts, Newark, Detroit, and Harlem. Many later historians and critiques preferred to call it an uprising, insisting either that the level of violence and size of the crowd did not warrant the use of the term riot, or conversely, calling it a riot degraded the importance of the event. Stonewall is often marked as the beginning of LGBTQ plus civil rights movements, but that is, of course, not true. LGBTQ people have been organizing politically since at least 1950, with the emergence of organizations such as the Machine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, the Janus Society, Society for Individual Rights, and Erickson Educational Foundation. Although these organizations were small, there were chapters of the fledgling groups across the United States by the 1960s. These organizations had magazines, conventions, and even staged demonstrations at the Pentagon, White House, Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Some say that Stonewall was the first time LGBTQ people fought back, which is also not true. Stonewall was preceded by earlier revolts such as the Cooper Donuts riot in Los Angeles in 1959, the Dewey's Restaurant sit-in in Philadelphia in 1965, the Compton's Cafeteria riot in San Francisco in 1966, and the protests against the raid of the Black Cat Tavern in Los Angeles in 1967, among many, many others. Scholars, participants, and interested public also debate how many days the uprising lasted and who threw the first brick, first bottle, or first punch, and more. Beyond any of these questions, we wonder what these events transpired 50 years ago really mean to us today. With all these contradictions, scholars and documentarians have struggled to do is sort out the truth. In his pioneering account, Stonewall, the historian Martin Duberman provides an inside view of the lead up and impact of the uprising through the lives of 6 LGBTQ activists. David Carter, in his thorough history, Stonewall, the Riots That Sparked the Great Gay Revolution, painstakingly compares the testimony and eyewitness accounts in order to reconstruct events. They have been followed by numerous documentations and everyday people who have tried to piece together what happened, why, and what ultimately means for LGBTQ people across the world. Rather than provide another closed narrative of these tumultuous events, my purpose with this anthology has been to allow readers to sort out these mysteries for themselves by reading the memoirs and testimonies of the participants and those immediately touched by these historical events. The anthology has been organized into 3 main sections: before, during, and after the Stonewall Uprising. In the before section, I have attempted to provide a range of narratives that give insight into what felt like to be LGBTQ in the 1950s and 60s, as well as giving an inkling to the range of activism that was emerging across the country before the uprising. We focused on but not limit ourselves to New York City. Given a tremendous range of stories, this section cannot be representative, but only hopeful to demonstrate a breadth of experience, introducing some key LGBTQ political figures of the time, such as Barbara Giddings, Frank Kameny, and Del Martin, as well as some possibly less well-known figures, such as Ernestine Eckstein and Mario Martino. There are many challenges to producing an anthology like this one, the first being copyright. So many LGBTQ texts of the mid-20th century are in publishing limbo. The texts are protected by copyright but have no clear representation that can authorize republishing them. This is particularly true of LGBTQ magazines, which were the main avenue for communication and community building. But an even greater challenge has to be the way LGBTQ archives we have inherited have already been structured by the exclusion from the record of the voices of people of color. The movement's own choice of the Stonewall Uprising as a symbol as LGBTQ struggle for liberation has many ways skewed the story to focus on the experience of the urban gay white man. In this anthology, I have endeavored to shift the narrative to a wider context to expand what does and does not count as a Stonewall memory. In order to understand this era, we have to understand that the history of sexuality and gender does not follow an even and upward march of progress towards freedom. Throughout history, there have been cycles of freedom and repression. Same-sex relationships were discreetly tolerated in the 19th century America in the form of romantic friendships, but the 20th century brought increasingly legal and medical regulation of homosexuality, which was considered a dangerous illness. At the same time, there was increased social awareness and of anxiety about transgender and gender nonconforming people as gender-confirming surgery became available. This change in attitudes was accompanied by pockets of resistance, spaces that gays, lesbians, and transgender people carved out for self-expression. Sometimes these places were hidden, like in the bars in Greenwich Village in Harlem, that were frequented only by those who knew. Sometimes it was in plain sight, like the homoerotic subtext and in-jokes of Hollywood movies. The representation of homosexuality reached its peak in the 1950s with the McCarthy era. During the paranoia of the Cold War, gay men and lesbians were seen as a corrupt, lurking menace easily used as pawns by communists. Gays and lesbians began to organize during the 1950s with homophile movements that were hampered by the lack of political language with which to express their experience, as they never were neither a class nor an ethnicity, but were instead considered victims of a moral and medical defect. The activities of this era fought for civil rights framed as inclusions in the law society at large, focusing on employment rights and military service. As LGBTQ people struggled to organize and respect themselves, the United States was torn by a succession of political struggles: the African American Civil Rights Movement, the women's movement, the protests against Vietnam, and the emergence of the hippie youth subculture that transformed the possibilities of political organization in the United States. The narratives in the first section speak to this mix of repression and resistance, as well as growing range of political forces inspiring LGBTQ communities. In the second section, I attempt to provide a wide range of memories of Stonewall Uprising itself, who exactly was not at the Stonewall Uprising is probably the most debated question in both scholarship and popular opinion. Even the eyewitnesses disagree about who was there. Given that the event took place over more than 5 days and involved thousands of people, we'll probably never know definitively who was there. For this reason, I have not attempted to police these narratives. I've taken witnesses at their word and as they were. The section begins with the news report about the events. The Machinate activist Dick Lettich account, the hairpin dropped heard around the world, which ran in the New York Machinate newsletter, and reported by Howard Smith and Lukovian Truskov IV, which ran in Village Voice. These articles were key in framing the events to the public and appearing in structured participants' memories as well. There then follows a wide testimony about the uprising, about the possibility of figures such as Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Martin Boyce, and Thompson Langen Schmidt, as well as LGBTQ figures we might not realize were personally touched by Stonewall's uprising, such as Holly Woodland and Jane Country. In order to preserve these voices of the subject, transcriptions, and remain faithful to the original interviews as much as possible, only correcting errors in spelling or punctuation in the transcriptions. The Stonewall Uprising was not the beginning of LGBTQ political activism, and not the first time LGBTQ people fought back against police repression. Then why was it singled out as a defining moment of history? The stories of these participants make it clear that it marked a convergence of homophile era activism with energy and vision of the civil rights, anti-war, and countercultural movements that were transforming the country. The patrons at Stonewall weren't card-carrying Mennonite members. They were inspired by the many resistances accepted authorities that were taking place in the culture at large. Although Stonewall Uprisings was indeed a spontaneous event, it was used by both seasoned and new LGBTQ activists as a symbol of the new revolution, a small flame of resistance that LGBTQ activists have been tending and fanning for decades, finally erupting into a mass political movement. In the final section of this book, I provide a section of personal accounts from the years following Stonewall and the tremendous explosion of activities and activist energy that resulted from the uprising. I have included memoirs and manifestos by LGBTQ activists in New York City, as well as Los Angeles, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Today's movement grew out of the activist organization that emerged in the fertile and tumultuous years that followed Stonewall. Organizations such as the Gay Liberation Front, Gay Activist Alliance, and the Radical Lesbians quickly sprung up in the wake of uprisings that tracked LGBTQ movements and activities in a whole new way. Rather than struggle merely for societal acceptance, they were calling for complete transformation of society as a whole, demanding not just equality but liberation. Veteran activists pursued their work with renewed courage and tenacity, tackling oppressive institutions such that psychiatrists' profession. The emerging political movement all sent small groups of activists on the road to spread the word. Activists around the country were inspired by the emerging revolutionary vision in the politics and quickly adopted its new language. Chapters sprung up across the country and may outlive the original groups in New York City. These groups fought civil rights and liberation of their home communities. In the 1970s became a gay and lesbian resistance with its own literature, music, politics, and erotic presence. LGBTQ activities won major political victories, such as the removal of homosexuality from the American Psychiatric Association's classification of mental disorders, and began to apply public pressure to combat negative stereotypes. The experience and energy of the times are clear in these narratives, but are also clear the differences among LGBTQ experience quickly became apparent in these movements. Lesbian activists soon tired of the sexism of their gay male political counterparts. Transgender activists were inspired by the gay liberation movement, but many generous sensualist lesbians and gay men attempted to silence them and push them out of the movement. African American, Latin, Latino, and Asian activists critiqued the racism of the movement and sought to create new cultural spaces for LGBTQ people of color. But the post-Stonewall political movement were inspired by anti-racist, feminist, and anti-imperialist politics. It was natural that these critical lenses would be used to analyze the movement itself. This era gave birth to political strategies, frameworks, critiques, and disagreements that continue to inform LGBTQ politics today. Clearly, understanding that they were making history, these activists also recognized the need to recover hidden histories of LGBTQ people. Among the many activist groups that worked to archive the history was the International Gay Information Center, IGIC, which grew out of the History Committee for Gay Activities Alliance, that's GAA. The IGIC archives operated as a commonly based repository until 1988, when the organization's directors gave the collection to the New York Public Library. These archives, along with the archives and collections subsequently donated to the library, comprehensively documented the political struggles in New York City since the 1950s and have made up NYPL's most important archive of LGBTQ history in the United States. The NYPL archives have grown into the ensuing years to include papers of pioneering activists such as Barbara Giddings, K. Tobin Lawson, Vito Russo, Joseph Beam, the manuscripts of LGBTQ writers including Walt Whitman, May Sarton, James Baldwin, as well as drag performers including Charles Pierce, Charles Bush, and Sylvester. The materials for this anthology, with two notable exceptions, have been drawn from this rich archive. The oral history archives of Eric Marcus have been an important resource for the anthology, providing the transcripts of interviews with Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Barton Boyce, Randy Wicker, and Morty Manford. Marcus's archive of interviews was assembled to support the writings of his book, Making Gay History, and lives on as the Making Gay History podcast. The library is currently partnered with NYC Trans Oral History Project to document the lives of trans people in New York, which has made it possible to present and preserve the stories of J. Lardon Toole, Miss Major Griffin Gracie, as well. The archives of Barbara Giddings and Carrie Tobin Lawson provide these narratives of Giddings as well as Craig Rodwell. The rich resource files of Martin Doberman supply the narratives of Thomas Langwin Schmidt, as well as many pointers. Lastly, the extensive book collection of the IGIC and the LGBT periodical collection provide the bulk of the materials. When I was first starting to work with the LGBTQ collection of the library, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. I was an early career librarian who had a chance to be part of the AIDS activist organization ACT UP, as well as the gay liberation movement, the Radical Fairies. The library was beginning to fund raising initiative to help promote and preserve these LGBTQ history collections and needed someone who could speak on the importance. In the ensuing years, it became a tremendous privilege to meet and work with several generations of pioneering LGBTQ activists, historians, and artists, some of whom were included in this book. I have been continually humbled and awed by the visionary courage. These people who have literally changed our world. The most important lesson that I have hopefully learned working through these archives is that they are people's lives. They are not just boxes of papers and magazines. They are people's memories, hopes, and dreams that have been trusted to us. It is my sincere hope that the readings of these stories will bring you closer to generations of LGBTQ activists who precede us and will help to fuel future struggles of liberation. Jason Ballman, the person who put together this collection. Now, of course, I will encourage you to check out this book later and read more for yourself, because I am unfortunately very pressed for time, and I'm going to have to take two selections from this instead of the very large selection I have available to me. So I will only be reading from portions that are within the post-Stonewall section. For those wanting a more broad background on such experiences, I highly recommend reading this book, as well as a few of the others in our collection. This first selection is from Perry Brass, writer and activist, former member of the Gay Liberation Front, co-editor of Come Out magazine, and co-founder of Gay Men's Health Project. In this piece for Come Out, Brass conveys the exhilaration experienced by thousands of people who participated in the Christopher Street Liberation Day 1970, the first LGBTQ Pride March. Article title, We Did It. We did it. The park was right there and it was ours. We had done it. It did not seem possible that it could be done. And it could be done over. That a long march could be over. The long march had been the culmination of a long, wonderful weekend, a weekend of love and warmth, and talking and seeing new people and finding out new things about ourselves and new people. How could this be over? So the park was right there, and once we got there, the question was what to do with it. Where was the music? Where were the speakers? What were we going to do with the park? And the answer, of course, was us. We were the speakers. Maybe 14,000 speakers. We were the music. Maybe 14,000 pieces of music, all inside of us, from the Stones to Mahler. And we were love. It was all around us, possibly for the first time since love had reappeared in the park on such large scale since the first Easter be there in 3 years ago than once before, to my knowledge. The sheep's meadow was filled with love. For we were there outrageously upfront with our love for each other. The world saw what we were for the first time in God knows, indeed God only knows, how many years. And one of the parade marshals said, "Sing it loud, sing it clear. We're not in the dark, crowded gay bars now. We're out in the open. Sing it loud, sing it clear. Gay is proud, gay is here." For some people, the march was and will be one of the highest points of their lives. Courage that was to take some people to make those first steps in the Sheridan Square into 6th Avenue and out to the village was the summing up of a whole lifetime's desire to finally come clear, say truth as it is, and expose themselves nakeder than any pin-up boy in any flesh book, to show their heads as well as their bodies, to put forth their hidden souls, where their bodies have been so for many years. It meant the possibility of taking all consequences unquestionably. For some people, this would be the first time in their lives they had indeed come out. Coming out of hiding, come out from the docks, the dark bars, the unlighted avenues that had been their refugees and their parents' faces, schools, jobs, and all the media's blackmail capacity that had made everything out in the streets now in the country. But that was where we were, out of the closets into the streets. "If your mother could only see you now," one old man on the sidewalk of the village shouted. Well, she certainly could if she tried hard enough, and it's about time she did, because it's about time 14 million, give or take a few million according to Kinsley, people in America stopped being bachelors or single Americans and started being gay women and men openly. For some people, the march was the thing, or getting to the park, together, and that's right on. But for many people, the whole week had been one of the busiest, most fruitful weeks of their lives, and that was that. It had been a week of gay pride. It had been a week of saying, "Do you know what week this is?" and answering, "Yes, it's Gay Pride Week." It had been a time of walking up to people you didn't know and watching their faces when they read things handed to them that said, "This is Gay Pride Week," and that was that. It was a fact. And whether you were gay, straight, or ambidextrous, that was it. It was Gay Pride Week, just like the coming of a holiday you've never heard about and feel suddenly discovered, and the holiday became a time feeling like mass feeling like Mardi Gras. Sunday night, some of us were tired. The festivals had exploded in front of us like great fireworks that we had only hoped would come off, and wow, had it. But we were there very tired, and being new people from all over the country, and feeding them at Washington Square Church, and hassling with wines and dancing and the GAA's massive dance, or the GLF's little vibrant dances and twisting joyous circle dances and working at shops at AU and sit-ins and from people. Most of all people, new people, old people, angry and loving people, tired from coming out and being ourselves, a much harder trip than the 3 miles walk from Sheridan Square to the park. Not walking in protest, but an affirmation that we exist and we are together, and together we are gay, and we are Gay Pride Week. The second reading for today is from Gian, and I am sorry for this last name's pronunciation, Cordova, who was an activist and writer editing the Lesbian Tide newspaper magazine in 1971. In When We Were Outlaws, a memoir of love and revolution, she describes many political intersections taking place in LGBTQ activism in Los Angeles in the 1970s, including protests with Morris Knight, coincide with the second anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. A selection from When We Were Outlaws. On June 27th, the night of the march, despite the widespread rumor that the LAPD was going to shut down the whole damn thing down and arrest everyone, 2,000 queer individuals showed up. The assemblage at the corners of Hawthorne and McCaden Place was mass confusion. I passed Freda Smith, a Sacramento organizer from the Gay Women's West Coast Conference, and yelled at her, "Grab everyone you see and tell them to look for the Lesbian Mothers banner." I pointed towards it at the head of the march. We lesbians didn't have much in the way of signs, but the conference, Del Martin had raised the issue of lesbian mothers losing custody of cases in court, an issue that scared many of us. Myself and other organizers had only convinced about half the attendees that marching in a gay parade was also a lesbian issue. To many of these women, Stonewall and Christopher Street West annual march was a gay male birthday. Because of the telltale organized armband, marchers were besieging me. They were arriving by car, foot, bus, and bicycle. Will there be trouble with the cops? Who should I march with? Most gay men looked blankly at me, saying they didn't belong to any group. They only heard that this was gay, Sunday in Hollywood. They'd hitchhiked from Phoenix or bused in from Colorado looking for someplace on earth to openly be gay. Even the group calling themselves the Gay Community Alliance had flown in from Hawaii. Finally, with the sun setting down on our backs, we were chanting and marching abreast down Hollywood Boulevard, every newly conscripted gay draftee shouting at the top of his and her voice. Dashing up and down as a monitor, I paused almost came to tears. A banner carried by an elderly straight woman who walked alone read, "Heterosexuals for homosexual freedom." I wanted to salute this woman. Someday, perhaps even my own life, gays will be free, I told myself. That day was not tonight. Uniformed cops with every stripe were everywhere. Several cars had male drivers dressed in full suit and tie, plainclothes LAPD, Vice, or Feds. The rumors of LAPD files were true. They were taking photos of every monitor and anyone who looked like they were organizing, including myself. When I was social working in South Central 3 years after the Watts Rebellion of '65, I'd seen many armed young men and learned that FBI counterintelligence programs were all over black activist communities. The feds wanted nothing more than to hunt down every member of the so-called insurrectionist Black Panthers, who they believed sought the violent overthrow of white America. Today they were here, but today this was my people, my march. Looking ahead, I saw the march was indeed breaking up into segments. Crowds were bunched up at those intersections. Monitors were not in place. Our people were looking vacantly at one another, wondering whether or not to venture into the traffic. I rushed into the hugely jammed intersection of Kahunga and monitored the marchers cross. Standing alone, my arms outstretched against the traffic, I tried to look imposing. An aging Ford stopped in front of me, and out of it emerged a bearded blonde in overalls who screamed, "The only good blank is a dead blank. Get the blank out of the way." I have blanked out language that would be offensive. "Ladies," I screamed to the group of feathered drag queens waiting in the corner, "come here, I need you a moment." And they frenziedly ran in devotedly into battle. "What's the matter, honey?" the group leader asked. I pointed towards the would-be Aryan. "Go kiss him. Get him back into his car so people can cross the intersection." The gaggle of drag queens descended upon the tall, now speechless blonde. One stroked his arm, another pinched his butt. The muscled man shrank from them immediately. The only safe place was his car. Quickly, he jumped back in, slammed the door, raised the windows, and locked himself in. Dragphobia had saved the day. "Right on," I yelled to my sisters as I marched through the intersection. Now safe. I looked forward. As planned, the head of the march was starting to leave the sidewalks and take to the streets. Seeing a banner reading out of the closets into the streets, I ran forward to meet Morris, arms raised in triumph. Los Angeles 1971's commemoration of Stonewall was the first of many grassroots events I would organize with Morris Knight over the next decades to fight for the rights of gay men and lesbians, struggling not just with politicians but also with other gay and lesbian leaders to keep our burgeoning movement from straying from its grassroots or, among other morasses, into new left of class politics. Still, it wasn't until 1974 that one of our particular efforts of making legislation change finally made with cumulative success. Of the things I learned from my mentor was to think outside the box, to revel in the unexpected. But I was more than a little shook of that summer when Morris called me and Troy Perry, the founder of the new gay Metropolitan Community Church, over to his McCaden Place haunt and asked us to volunteer to be arrested as sex criminals. Morris has decided that the quickest way to bring down California's penal codes against sodomy and oral copulation, PC 288A and 286, was to get a gay, lesbian, and straight couple to publicly confess these sex crimes and trick the police into arresting us. Those couples turned out to be Troy and his lover, Steve Gordon, a straight couple named Jeannie Barney and her boyfriend, and me, Bijou. I hesitated about this caper, but always found it difficult to say no to Morris. Finally, I committed us. Bijou didn't share my readiness. She panicked when I brought the legal paperwork home to sign. I haven't come out to my parents in Iowa. You're out of your mind. It was eerily quiet in our apartment that night as Bijou and I didn't speak. I was wondering if Troy's young lover, the new movement, was making things tense at his house too. I'd noticed that Morris hadn't put himself forward. I don't have a lover, he said. His role in the plan was to make a citizen's arrest and haul us down to Rampart Division Police Headquarters after the press conference. I don't suppose you have a backup lesbian couple, I asked Morris on the phone. Bijou hadn't said yes. No, I can't find any other out lesbian couple willing to do this, he said, but don't worry, our lawyers will be at the police station to bail you out as soon as possible. The evening passed time like a broken clock. Finally, I heard Bijou call in to work saying she'd come down with a cold and needed to be off tomorrow. By the time I arrived at Los Angeles Press Club, Bijou was covered with anxiety-provoked sweat. Cameras were flashing, microphones popping under the bright lights of the press club. Somehow the risk felt surreal. I read aloud my carefully composed statement. I am here in the name of thousands of lesbian mothers who have stood before California judges and heard, this woman is unfit, she has no right to her child, because she is homosexual. I am here in the name of hundreds of lesbians who have dishonorably discharged from the services, thrown out their jobs, their homes, and their churches. In the name of those whose lives have been ruined by the name of the Penal Code's law, I demand to be arrested. Morris's smiling face at the end of the table gave me courage. I went on to recount the two women in Michigan had been arrested for making love in their camping tent in the forest. One of them had just finished serving 3 years in the state pen. By the end of the press conference, the LA Times had showed up, but the police had not. Morris stood up and arrested us in the name of the good state of California. He promptly loaded us in the bus, bannered with the sign, the Felsen 6, in which he took a slow but very public arrive, waving and explaining our actions to sidewalk passerbys through the major boulevards of Hollywood and downtown LA. Once inside the Rampart station, the media-savvy Commander Wise announced, I will not take custody of these people. We did not see the crime in action. So it was off to the district attorney's office, where our straight lawyer, there were no gay lawyers out in 1974, insisted to the DA that he didn't need to see our crimes in person because there was nothing in the law exempting private and consensual oral compilation. Assistant DA Jacobson met with our lawyer behind closed doors for almost an hour. We felons and our entourage waited, standing with hope that hopeful Bijou and young Steve, while the entire DA's staff gawked at us, the self-confessed homosexuals. Finally, a much distressed Jacobson went before the gathered press cameras. Any groups or individuals who wish to change current laws in California should take their complaints to the state legislature, he said. I didn't make the law. Then he instructed his security to escort us out of his office. Being arrested for trespassing seemed anticlimactic and not on message. We cleared out. Once home, we printed thousands of leaflets urging gay couples to openly break these penal codes. Months later, California Governor Jerry Brown, pushed strongly by Morris Knight and the whole statewide gay and lesbian movement, signed an executive order overturning California's anti-sodomy laws. My mentor and I were one giant step closer to the freedom of our people. And that's all we've got time for today. My name is Robert. This has once again been Word of Mouth. here at MCCPL. We have this and many, many other books about American history in our collection. Should you be interested, come on by. It's in the adult nonfiction section. Call numbers are in the 300s for this one, but there are also call numbers in the 900s if you are so interested. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.